So, my name is Mateo Cordier. I'm a social scientist from the field of ecological economics, and I would like to talk today about the discrepancies between the perspective of scientists and small coastal Arctic communities regarding ice and climate changes. And so I will take a talk about the case of the Umanak community in Greenland. The goal of this presentation is to analyze how scientific literature on global changes and adaptation match with Inuit perspectives. We would like, with the work, fill the gap between Arctic coastal communities and scientific research, and the final aim is try to bring a contribution to the improvement of adaptation strategies to global changes. I say global changes because it's always hard, as you know, to distinguish climate changes, political changes, economic changes. It's all a big mess, and it's not so evident to identify one key factor. So this is the fieldwork, Umanak. We've been there twice. First time was in October, November 2014. So we have the Umanak Bay here, Umanak city here. And so Umanak is a very small community, 2,300 inhabitants, divided between a main island and several small islands. During this first fieldwork, we've been interviewing 18 persons. We had 2 official meetings with official representatives of the city and business men and women. We had 1 community gathering. Very often it was a birthday in the village, or a dinner in the children's home of Umanak, and 2 boat trips to islands called settlements. In the second fieldwork, it happened in April 2015. We interviewed 25 persons, so it was 7 individual interviews, 4 focus groups with 2 persons, 1 focus group with 10 persons. It was this focus group at the hunting school. We had 2 snowmobile trips with hunters, 1 dog sled trip with a fisherman, Albert, the fisherman here. We've been fishing with him, quite a good experience. And several community gathering, again, birthdays in the village and dinner at the children's home. So the methods we applied with these 2 field trips was semi-structured interview and focus group. Focus group, it was a bit more difficult because it's always difficult to gather many people together. It was already difficult to have individual interviews because people are really willing to cooperate with us, but they have also their own life, not so much time to spend to answer our questions. So quite often they accept to receive us for dinner or for the coffee. And then at 11 o'clock in the night, you say, and now maybe the question, oh, yes, if we have time, maybe. And then we also use the experience of Jean-Michel Huquetin, which is an anthropologist. He has spent almost 20 years. He lived 4 years in Umanak, and every year he come back to the island since the last 20 years. And he has been carrying out participant observation. And so we also rely on his knowledge and his experience. We also applied detailed literature review to identify the gaps between the science on climate change related to ice and the knowledge, the experience of people in Umanak related to ice. We wanted to understand how they perceive the ice, what ice, why the ice, etc., and to see if there is discrepancies between scientific knowledge and local knowledge, local needs in information on ice. So this is the kind of question we asked. For instance, during the second field trip, we showed them scientific data on ice, and then we asked them if it was providing a useful and a meaningful information to them. So of course, at first they say, oh yes, to be nice, but very quickly the first answer was For instance, among the 7 categories of ice, this is the main one, maybe the only one of interest to them, sea ice. This graph was also interesting to us. It's a very nice graph, I think. But we were there in April 2015. That's great because we had this curve, very recent one, for the ice extent in the Arctic, the global region of the Arctic. And so we showed them this graph, and we showed them this is the year with the lowest extent of ice in the Arctic, April 2015. I was there in April. We looked by the window, and the sea ice was very, very good, very solid. It was an amazing year for them. So this was the opportunity to start to speak about global scale data and local scale data, and we start to understand they were interested in local data. Global data on the Arctic region was not really interesting to them and not very useful for them, which doesn't mean the information is not useful, but for the purpose of our work, it was not useful to them. Another question we asked in the first field trip was looking at this image, which is the image with close to the region of the Umanak Bay. Can you identify, please, places that are changing? So it was a way to start to discuss the topics of changes, climate changes, political changes, cultural changes, economic changes. But we ask changes to open discussion as much as possible, so that if they wanted to raise the issue of climate changes, they were free to do it, but it was not an obligation. It was a way for us to avoid, sorry for my accent, to bias the discussion, which was not easy because we had also a problem of translation. We then realized that the word changes we used was for climate changes. We didn't know. So each time we asked for changes, they directly speak about climate changes. So we said, we let them speak, but in the end we said, you are free to speak about any changes. We had to correct a bit the interview because of this translation problem, unfortunately. Because their interviews were made in Greenlandic, of course. So we have preliminary results. First, when we did the literature review, we used the bibliometrics tool Scopus. So Scopus is a tool which is screening 22,000 scientific journals in the world. And so we just enter keywords like climate change, ice, Arctic, and we look what is going out. And so we found papers, scientific papers on all these categories of ice, and we were glad to see that the sea ice is the most studied category of ice in the Arctic related to climate changes. So when we had this first graph, we said, oh, maybe this is the end of this study, there is nothing to say. Scientific publications match very well with the needs in information on ice for the Umanak inhabitants. They are interested in sea ice. There is a lot of publication on sea ice, that's it. And then we digged deeper into the literature review because we thought, from the interviews and from the experience of Jean-Michel Huctin, we know that they are only interested in winter sea ice, not summer sea ice, because in Umanak, there is no sea ice in summer, only in winter. And we knew that in the IPCC publications and many other, very often they show big maps of summer sea ice. So we had the assumption that maybe scientists on climate change and ice only work on summer sea ice. No, of course they don't. But yes, it seems that they work more on winter sea ice, on summer sea ice than on winter sea ice. And to produce this graph, we looked, the keyword was sea ice, climate change, Arctic, summer, and then all the months of summer, and we have this. And the same for winter. And so we thought, but maybe this is wrong because maybe there is publication on winter and summer sea ice at the same time, which is true. This is the curve of publication on both season sea ice. and it's filling the gap. So it's a well-balanced, a good balance between winter and summer sea ice. So there is no gaps between scientific knowledge and the needs in ice knowledge for the Umana community. Again, we said maybe this is the end of the study. This is not very interesting to keep on. And then we thought that maybe there is other information we should look for. But what I can say from previous graph is that the category of ice and the season of the ice, winter, is matching the needs of Umana community. But the question is how this ice is measured. What is measured in this ice? And maybe our feeling from the interviews and the focus group was that what people want to know in Umanak is the ice practicable? Can I go there to dog sledding to the other village to see my friends or my family? Can I go there to fish, to hunt, to have these dog sleds contests, competition? And what would be a good measure of ice to know if it's practicable for my activities or not? Maybe it would be sea ice thickness. So we looked for sea ice thickness information and something else. Any measurement of sea ice, whatever it is, sea ice thickness, sea ice extent, sea ice concentration, should be close to the coast. Many publications in the Arctic on sea ice, it's far from the coast because they want to know how the ice is retreating years after years in summer. But people in Umanak and maybe all small coastal Arctic communities in Greenland, they are interested in sea ice close to the coast because their practice of sea ice is close to the coast. But first, regarding the measurement, so we thought our assumption was sea ice thickness is the most interesting information for Umanak inhabitants. And it's the least studied by scientific natural scientists. Scientists are more studying sea ice extent and sea ice concentration. So I had to understand what means extent and concentration because I'm not a natural scientist, I'm an economist. I had no clue about these terms. So I asked my colleague Maxence Rojo, who is here today, to explain me that. And maybe you are familiar with these terms, I don't know. Ice concentration is just a term to say how many ice you have in a reference area. For instance, a box of 25 square kilometers. This box is covered by 0% concentration, no ice. 20% concentration, young ice, very scattered. 100% concentration, full of ice. But you don't know how thick it is. Maybe it's very thin. Then you have another measurement, ice extent. So the ice extents, you have a map, you have cells, grid cells in the map, and the ice extents say this cell is ice covered or not. So the value is 0, no ice, or 1, ice. And the thresholds to decide if there is or there is not ice, you use ice concentration measurement, and you say, for instance, a typical threshold is 15%. In each cell, you have 15% concentration of ice, its value of 1, you have ice. And doing this on all the map, the cells of the map, you can measure the ice extent. But again, if you have an ice extent of 100 square kilometers, with a 15% concentration, is not very practicable. So my conclusion, and if I'm wrong, please tell me. I would be interested to hear that. My assumption was ice concentration, ice extent is interesting information, is useful, but it's not sufficient. People in Umanak, they need to know information about ice thickness. So this is just about what I said. So partly, yes, ice concentration and ice extent are informative, are relevant at the condition they are close to the coast. So in the first meters and maximum 100, 150, maybe 200 kilometers from the coast. No more, because beyond nobody goes there. For instance, some hunters who are hunting polar bears, they go to the ice edge to 500 kilometers from the coast. But even if this information is useful, to know what is the extent of hunting or fishing activities or social activities such as dog sledding, they need to have information about ice thickness. This might be a complementary information. And in fact, maybe the ice extent and ice concentration, it's an information more useful to international shipping, because you can have ice extent which covers large area, but if it's low concentration, then marine transport is possible. So these two information maybe are more appropriate or very useful to international shipping more than to human inhabitants. So since the proximity to the coast was an important factor, we tested that. We wanted to see if the sea ice in winter, which is the one which is interesting human inhabitants, is also studied close to the coast. And realized it's not so much studied. It is studied, of course, but not so much. Most papers study sea ice in winter in general, and few papers study sea ice in winter close to the coast. So this gap should be filled for sea ice publication to be useful for human inhabitants and other small coastal Arctic communities. And I wanted to see if sea ice thickness in winter close to the coast was studied, which is the most relevant information for human inhabitants. It is studied, but really at low level. So sea ice thickness in winter close to the coast, it's very low level of publication on this topic. So conclusions, if I can try to make some recommendations for the ice studies to properly inform adaptation strategies of small coastal Arctic communities in Greenland, I would say that natural scientists should develop, maybe the word forecast is too strong, but at least they should develop studies that address winter sea ice close to the coast. This is important because this is the place where people live. And maybe they should also address more than nowadays sea ice thickness in winter close to the coast. And as underlined by Carothers and her colleagues in 2014, it's increasingly important to document local observations of climate change and their impacts on livelihoods. So, and local observations, it's put in bold here because in our interviews, nobody said in our interviews, I want local observations. But the first graph on sea ice extent variation in the whole Arctic region, when we saw their reaction, they were laughing at this graph. They said, look by the window, this is wrong. We understood, okay, this is the discrepancies. Global measurements versus local measurements, which are needed by human inhabitants. And nobody is wrong, it's just two perspectives. I will stop now. I'm afraid that without relevant information on sea ice, maybe small coastal Arctic communities could not properly adapt. Of course, they have adaptive capacity, but to have a full adaptive capacity, they should be properly informed. Thank you very much.